blessing of having some angel families with us as well. They are here in the audience, and I'm so grateful for them for being willing to come here and be strong. It's hard to lose someone that you dearly love to illegal criminal activity, to people who never should have been in our country to begin with, and to lose those loved ones to drug overdoses that get perpetuated by the terrorist organizations that filter them into our country that President Trump works so hard to stop. So I'm grateful that they're here and that they are telling their story. Under President Biden, he closed the office in the Department of Homeland Security that serviced these families. He closed it because he didn't want them to speak. He didn't want them to have support or services. And President Trump reopened the Voices office so that they can get services, so they can hear about the cases of the individuals who killed their family members, and they can get the kind of help that they need to get through the tragic grief that they've experienced. So I want to thank them for being here and continue to pray for them. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be in front of you today to discuss
what you just witnessed there, what you just experienced pouring through your screen like venom distilled into pure political theater, represents something far more sinister than a mere governor standing at a podium, deploying her monthly dose of xenophobic talking points. And let me tell you why this matters, why this precise moment crystallizes the entire Republican strategy, heading deeper into this administration after Trump's inauguration, when Noem was confirmed by the Senate in a 59-34 vote. Because Noem was sworn in on January 25, 2025, as Secretary of Homeland Security, giving her unprecedented power to execute exactly the kind of deportation regime she's now championing, with those grieving families arranged like props behind her. This isn't about helping victims. This is about constructing a permission structure for state violence against vulnerable communities. And before you think I'm being hyperbolic, before you accuse me of overreach, let me walk you through the architecture of deception you just watched unfold, because every single element of that performance was calculated to achieve maximum emotional manipulation while obscuring the actual empirical reality of immigration and crime in America. First, the angel families themselves. And I want to be absolutely clear here, because this is where the moral complexity becomes almost unbearable. These families have experienced genuine tragedy. They have lost loved ones to violence. Their grief is real and profound and deserves acknowledgement. Full stop. But Kristi Noem is not interested in their grief as human suffering. She's interested in their grief as political ammunition, as a cudgel with which to beat an entire demographic group and justify policies that have nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with cruelty as policy. Because here's what she's counting on you not knowing. Immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, are less likely to commit crimes than the U.S.-born, and this finding holds at the national, state, county, and neighborhood levels, and for both violent and nonviolent crime. The American Immigration Council analyzed crime data alongside demographic data and found that as the immigrant share of the population grew from 6.2% in 1980 to 13.9% in 2022, the crime rate dropped by 60.4%, which means that the very premise of her presentation, the foundational claim that immigrants represent a unique criminal threat requiring special offices and heightened enforcement, collapses under the weight of actual evidence, and yet she stands there with absolute confidence weaponizing individual tragedies to construct a narrative that contradicts every credible study conducted on this subject. And bombshell after bombshell is about to drop here, because let's talk about this Voice office. This Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement office that Noem claims Biden shut down because he didn't want them to speak, because that accusation is so breathtakingly cynical, so transparently bad faith, that it demands immediate dismantling. The Voice office was established within the Department of Homeland Security under the first Trump administration in February 2017, and critics immediately pointed out that the office overlapped and duplicated the mission of the existing Office for Victims of Crime within the Department of Justice, which was established in the 1980s and serves victims of all types of crime. The National Center for Victims of Crime said, "Voice is a poor use of scarce resources for crime victims and may actually block victims from exercising their rights," and they pointed out that Trump had promised severe funding cuts to existing offices within DOJ, with proven records of helping victims. So Biden didn't close the office to silence victims. Voice was replaced by the Victims Engagement and Services line, which combined long-standing existing services and added a service for potential recipients of visas designated for victims of human trafficking or violent crimes, because Secretary Mayorkas stated that all people, regardless of their immigration status, should be able to access victim services without fear. The Biden administration actually expanded victim services to be more inclusive, to help all victims regardless of whether their perpetrator was documented or undocumented. But that doesn't serve Noem's narrative that doesn't allow her to claim that Democrats hate victims and want them silenced, so she simply lies. She constructs an alternative reality where closing a duplicative, politically motivated office represents abandoning crime victims rather than what it actually represented, which was integrating services into a more comprehensive and effective framework. Now we're getting to the real bombshell, the thing that should make your blood absolutely boil with righteous fury, and it's this. Noem has hailed the more than $200 million taxpayer-funded ad campaign as a crucial tool to stem illegal immigration, and her agency invoked the national emergency at the border to award contracts for the campaign, bypassing the normal competitive bidding process. ProPublica's investigation revealed that the Department of Homeland Security has kept at least one beneficiary of the 9-figure ad deal a secret, a Republican consulting firm with long-standing personal and business ties to Noem and her senior aides at DHS. So while she's standing there with angel families talking about the tragedy of losing loved ones to criminal activity, she's funneling hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars to her political cronies under the guise of border security. One of her closest advisors in South Dakota, 28-year-old Madison Sheehan, now serves at DHS as the second-in-command of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Because this has never been about public safety, this has always been about grift and power and constructing a deportation machine that enriches political allies while terrorizing communities. And here's where the emotional manipulation reaches its apex, where Noem's performance becomes truly Orwellian in its inversion of reality. She claims that these families lost loved ones to illegal criminal activity, to people who never should have been in our country to begin with, linking their deaths to drug overdoses that get perpetuated by the terrorist organizations that filter them into our country. And this formulation is designed to create a seamless narrative where immigration equals crime equals terrorism equals drug trafficking, a totalized threat that justifies any response, any level of state violence, any separation of families, any denial of due process. But the actual evidence tells a completely different story. In the more recent time period, immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than U.S.-born citizens, and 30% less likely relative to U.S.-born whites, and unauthorized immigrants by far had the lowest offending rates compared to the U.S.-born and lawfully present immigrants in Texas. Northwestern University economist Elisa Giacomo, who led a study analyzing 150 years of census data, found that immigrants with lower levels of education today are significantly less likely to commit crimes than their U.S.-born counterparts, suggesting that immigrants may be more resistant to economic shocks that have affected less educated men in recent decades. Let's talk about what's really happening here, about the historical patterns that make this moment so chillingly familiar to anyone who has studied authoritarian movements and the construction of scapegoat populations, because the scapegoating of ethnic and religious minorities is well-tread historical ground in the United States, and Chinese, Irish, Italian, Muslim, Mexican people have been falsely accused of bringing crime into the country, particularly during times of economic or political unease. What Noem is doing, what this entire apparatus of angel families and voice offices and illegal criminal activity rhetoric is designed to accomplish, is the construction of what Giorgio Agamben would call a state of exception, a permanent emergency condition that suspends normal legal protections and allows the state to exercise sovereign power over bare life, and immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, become the population over which this power can be exercised without limit, without accountability, because they've been successfully positioned outside the circle of those deserving rights and dignity. And here comes another bombshell that will absolutely devastate the foundation of Noem's entire presentation. FBI data shows that U.S. crime was down significantly in 2023, with violent crimes down 3% from 2022, and property crimes down 2.4%, while murder dropped 11.6%, and sociology professor Graham Ossie noted that the FBI data is inconsistent with the idea that an influx of migrants is driving up crime across the U.S. Even more damning to the Republican narrative, there was a 30% spike in U.S. homicides in 2020, the same year immigration dropped sharply because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and border crossings and apprehensions dropped dramatically, while the U.S. saw the largest increase in homicide on record, with these homicide increases disproportionately involving young black men, suggesting they had little to do with immigration flows. So when crime actually surged in America, it happened precisely when immigration was at its lowest point in years, completely contradicting the causal story that Noem and her Republican colleagues are desperate to sell to the American public. Now let me hit you with the really infuriating part, the element of this performance that reveals just how little Republicans actually care about the families they parade in front of cameras. Because if you genuinely wanted to help victims of violent crime, if you actually prioritized public safety over political theater, you would support the policies that evidence demonstrates reduce crime. You would invest in the social services and community programs and economic opportunities that create stable neighborhoods. You would address the actual root causes of violence, which are poverty and inequality, and the easy availability of firearms and the collapse of social cohesion under neoliberal capitalism, but that would require acknowledging that crime is a complex social phenomenon rooted in structural conditions, and it wouldn't give you a convenient other to demonize. It wouldn't allow you to mobilize racial resentment and xenophobic panic for electoral advantage. And most importantly, but it wouldn't justify the construction of a massive deportation infrastructure that serves corporate interests by creating a perpetually terrorized workforce that's too afraid to demand fair wages or safe working conditions. Let's examine the recent congressional testimony that reveals the absolute chaos and corruption at the heart of Noem's DHS, because an annual hearing to review threats facing the U.S. ended with an effort by Democrats to subpoena Noem after she exited the hearing early, and while she said she was leaving to attend a different meeting, that event was canceled, prompting Democrats to suggest she may have misled the panel. This is your champion of law and order. This is the person claiming to stand with victims, and she can't even be bothered to complete a congressional hearing about homeland security threats. She literally walks out and then lies about why she left. And during that same hearing, Rep. Monica McIver accused Noem of fueling bigotry with her comments and illegal actions to broadly target immigrants, stating that when DHS is breaking the law, lying to the American public, systematically dismantling oversight, fueling bigotry, and targeting vulnerable communities, trust is broken. The cruelty is the point, as Adam Serwer famously wrote, but it's also the strategy. It's the deliberate construction of a politics based on sadism and spectacle, rather than governance and human flourishing. And here's what makes this moment particularly dangerous, particularly worthy of our sustained outrage and organized resistance. It's that rhetoric about immigration has had a dramatic impact on public opinion, with the number of people supporting deportation of undocumented immigrants jumping from 32% to 47% between 2016 and 2024, and in July 2024, 55% of Americans said they wanted to see immigration levels decrease. The propaganda works. The constant drumbeat of angel families and illegal criminal activity and terrorist organizations reshapes public consciousness. It manufactures consent for policies that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Donald Trump has been the most prominent promoter of the false link between immigration and crime, according to the Associated Press, and Guadalupe Correa Cabrera argues it is a cornerstone of the MAGA platform. What we're witnessing is the mainstreaming of fascist rhetoric and policy, the normalization of state violence against vulnerable populations, the construction of a politics premised on the idea that some human beings are inherently criminal, inherently threatening, inherently unworthy of rights and dignity based solely on their national origin and immigration status. Let me give you one more absolutely devastating piece of evidence that exposes the bad faith at the heart of this entire enterprise, because remember that Biden actually tried to address immigration policy. Biden expanded lawful pathways and kept families together, believing that immigrants who have been in the United States for decades, paying taxes and contributing to their communities, are part of the social fabric, and while Congress failed to act on reforms, the Biden-Harris administration worked to strengthen the lawful immigration system, implementing actions that would protect approximately 500,000 spouses of U.S. citizens and approximately 50,000 non-citizen children under the age of 21. But 16 Republican-led states sued to block the Keeping Families Together program's continued implementation, and U.S. District Judge J. Campbell Barker issued a stay temporarily halting grants of parole in place, and ultimately Barker ruled that the Biden administration had overstepped its authority by implementing the program. So when Biden tried to create legal pathways that would actually address the humanitarian concerns while maintaining border security, Republicans sued to block it, because they don't want solutions. They want crisis. They want chaos. They want the perpetual emergency that justifies authoritarian power and keeps voters mobilized through fear. When she talks about people who never should have been in our country to begin with, she's articulating a vision of America where entire categories of human beings are inherently suspect, where brown and black bodies from certain countries are presumptively criminal, where the accident of birthplace determines your moral worth and your right to exist in particular spaces. This is race science dressed up in the language of law enforcement. This is eugenics refracted through immigration policy, and it has consequences that extend far beyond immigration enforcement itself, because when you establish that some human beings can be treated as less than human based on their status, when you construct a politics premised on cruelty toward the vulnerable, when you build institutions designed to terrorize and punish and separate families. That infrastructure, that moral logic, that distribution of state violence doesn't remain contained to one population. It metastasizes, it expands, it finds new targets, new populations to discipline and control. And what absolutely enrages me, what should enrage every person watching this, who claims to care about justice and human dignity, is that research does not support the view that immigrants commit crime or are incarcerated at higher rates than native-born Americans, and in fact immigrants might have less law enforcement contact compared to non-immigrants. Yet Noem stands there with absolute confidence, with grieving families behind her as human shields, peddling a lie that has been comprehensively debunked by every credible study, by FBI data, by state-level analysis, by 150 years of incarceration records. She knows she's lying. Or if she doesn't know, she's committed willful ignorance in service of an agenda that requires ignorance to function, that demands we not look at evidence, that insists we respond to individual anecdotes and manufactured crises rather than systemic analysis and empirical data. The Brennan Center for Justice put it perfectly when they noted that the factors that drive crime rates are extraordinarily complex and can rarely be reduced to one cause, and policymakers should refrain from blaming immigrants as a group for increased crime where data does not substantiate those claims, because doing otherwise will hinder the development of effective crime prevention policies that can help make communities safer for everyone. But effective crime prevention isn't the goal. Community safety isn't the objective. Justice for victims isn't the priority, because if any of those things were actually driving Republican immigration policy, they would support the evidence-based interventions that reduce crime, they would invest in the programs that help victims regardless of perpetrator status, they would acknowledge that numerous studies show that immigration is not linked to higher levels of crime, but rather the opposite, and immigration is associated with lower crime rates and an increase in structural factors, such as social connection and economic opportunity, that are linked to neighborhood safety. We need to be absolutely clear about what this administration is constructing, what Noem is implementing with Trump's full support, and the complicity of congressional Republicans who have spent the past several years making immigration their singular issue, making the border their defining crisis, making deportation and enforcement and cruelty the cornerstones of their political identity. They're building a deportation machine of unprecedented scale and sophistication. They're normalizing military-style raids on communities. They're separating families and traumatizing children and destroying lives, and they're doing it all while wrapping themselves in the flag and claiming to speak for victims, claiming to represent law and order, claiming to protect American communities from an invented threat that exists nowhere, except in their rhetoric and their propaganda, and their politically motivated distortions of reality. And the final bombshell, the thing that should crystallize your understanding of what's really happening here, is that the entire debate about illegality is not the main issue anymore for Republicans in both chambers of Congress, and the main goal seems to be to reduce the number of foreigners in the United States to the greatest extent possible, because Trump worked to prevent the passage of border security legislation, because turmoil on the border benefits him, and his nativism now encompasses all forms of immigration, as he has pledged to curb legal channels for people to enter the country as well. This has never been about border security, or public safety, or helping victims. It's always been about constructing a white nationalist vision of America, about mobilizing racial resentment for political power, about creating a permanent underclass of terrorized workers who can be exploited without limit, about dismantling the multiracial democracy that threatens conservative minority rule. So what do we do? How do we respond to this performance of cruelty, this weaponization of grief, this systematic construction of a politics based on lies and fear and state violence against vulnerable communities? We tell the truth, relentlessly and exhaustively. We cite the evidence, we point to the studies, we name the manipulation and the bad faith and the cynical exploitation of tragedy for political gain. We organize in our communities to protect our immigrant neighbors, to resist raids and deportations, to build sanctuary spaces and mutual aid networks that embody the solidarity that fascism seeks to destroy. We vote, we mobilize, we support candidates and movements committed to justice rather than cruelty, to evidence-based policy rather than propaganda, to human dignity rather than dehumanization. We refuse to accept the premise that some human beings are inherently criminal based on where they were born. We reject the politics of scapegoating and fear. We insist on a vision of America that actually lives up to its professed values of justice and equality and human rights. And we never let them forget what they're doing, who they're hurting, and what future they're building, because our collective memory, our sustained resistance, Our refusal to normalize the abnormal and accept the unacceptable, that's the only thing standing between the multiracial democracy we're fighting for and the authoritarian nightmare they're constructing, one speech, one raid, one separated family at a time.